Hello everyone. This presentation is entitled What is Translation? Towards New Paradigms. The main goal of this presentation is to shed light on the new conception of translation in both translation studies and cultural studies. The main question raised is whether translation is just a linguistic process or is it something larger and broader in both theory and application. The presentation sheds light on the typology of translation as both linguistic and cultural. And at the same time, it tries to contribute to new conceptions of translation in the 21st century. The title of this slide is Translation Semantic Family. What is the meaning of a semantic family? It is the group of semantic and lexical items that relate to one particular lexical and semantic category, namely here translation. So translation has a lot of types, a lot of contexts, a lot of goals, a lot of skills, and a lot of professionals. So translators are the ones in charge of translating. Language is the medium of translation. Cultural research is relevant to cultural studies and translation studies. The title of this slide is in Arabic translation the semantic family. الترجمة العائلة الدلالية. Here you have a lot of terms in Arabic which are completely new to the Arabic culture and language, such as الترجمة الثقافية or cultural translation. You have also النشاطية, which is activism. And of course, you have a lot of traditional terms such as الثقافة المصدر, الثقافة المستهدفة, النص المستهدف, أو النص الهدف, أو النص المصدر. All are translations of the terms target text, target culture, source text, and source culture. You have also another new term which is التوطين or localization, which is completely new to the Arab world and Arabic culture in particular, because it relates to the context of globalization in general and multinational corporations. So here you have, for example, different types of translation. You have written translation and oral translation, and its different types. So you have الترجمة الشفهية والترجمة التحريرية, and the different types of الترجمة الشفهية, الترجمة الفورية والتتابعية وخلافه. And of course you have one strategy of translation, which is التغريب or foreignization. Here the translator might actually foreignize or foreignize the English context or the language context of the target text by introducing new foreign terms as they are without translation. You have also النشاطية, which is activism, المقاومة, resistance, إعادة الكتابة, rewriting, which are all new terms that relate mainly to post-colonial studies and post-colonial translation studies. Here you have this connection between translation as a linguistic and cultural process and politics and power relations on the other hand. The title of this slide is mainly a question. What is translation? And it is actually a concept here given according to classical concepts, which are so prevalent in translation studies in the 1980s and before. Of course, here the main definition is translation as a straightforward linguistic transfer of meaning from a source language into a target language. So this definition actually neglects the other dimensions in the translating process, such as the cultural and historical contexts. Of course, here the linguistic transfer of meaning just relates to the linguistic background of language as a medium of communication. That's why the main criteria are based on the parallelism or the equivalence between the source and the target languages, regardless of the context in which this sort of communication exists. So here you have the concepts of adequacy, appropriateness, accuracy, faithfulness, and equivalence as the main criteria according to which any sort of translation is assessed. Other criteria, like for example, the correctness of culture-specific forms, norms, and patterns are completely non-present. If I say, for example, something in German, the translator has to actually translate it as it is without any deviation, without any modification into English or French, regardless of the cultural and historical context of the translation in question. The other slide here is also a question, what is translation? But here the question is raised from a different perspective. That is actually the perspective, namely of postmodern concepts. The postmodern concept of translation is completely different from the traditional or modern concept of translation as based on equivalence. Here, culture plays a major role in the conception and crystallization of translation as an epistemic paradigm in translation and cultural studies. That's why translation is here defined as a form of rewriting. And that's why the translator is considered as an active agent who is visible in the process of translating. He is not invisible as before. He is not backgrounded as in previous studies or theories of translation. The cultural background of the translator and the historical context in which he translates are very important and relevant to the assessment of the translation process in general. That's why rewriting here indicates agency, hyperactivity, and the major role of the writer as well as the major role of the translator. Both of them are important for the production of knowledge. And here this is actually something untraditional and innovative, starting with the translation studies phase in the 1990s. Here you have a different set of concepts related to the cultural turn in translation studies, mainly those of resistance, activism, identity, sexual politics, and power relations. So, power relations have to be taken into consideration while assessing the weight and significance or relevance of any translating process. So, as you will see in the coming slides, you will notice how different speeches given by political figures, for example, can be translated in different forms according to the postmodern historical context in which the translation takes place. So here the translator has to bear in mind that he is addressing a different audience, an audience that is different from that of the original audience or recipient of the original message. He has to rewrite the message in order to make it more appropriate for the taste and reception of the recipient readers or audience in general. Now, the presentation tries to find a solution for the split between cultural studies and translation studies by offering a particular typology which takes into consideration that translation is one process but of a double nature. You have what is known as cultural translation, and the other type is what here called linguistic translation. Now, cultural translation has been tackled as a concept and a paradigm by different cultural studies theorists. Cultural translation has been focused on especially in relation to the writings of immigrant writers and post-colonial literatures in general. So the post-colonial writer has to rewrite his own culture in a way that is appropriate for the global audience. He or she must try to translate their own cultural heritage in new terms that are acceptable by new readership. So cultural translation can be defined as a cross-cultural communication of culture-specific content, mainly consisting of sets of beliefs, customs, and world visions. So, for example, if you are trying to translate the word as-Sufiyya from Arabic into English, you cannot translate it as, for example, Islamic, mysticism. You need to translate the culture-specific nature of as-Sufiyya into English by giving it an English name that is mainly Sufism. Sufism, which is a peculiar aspect of Islamic Arabic culture, is completely different from mysticism, which is peculiar to Western Christian culture. And when we move to linguistic translation, here, of course, this is the original traditional meaning of translation in previous traditional translation studies, which considers translation as a linguistic transfer of meaning, and here linguistic actually comprising pragmatic, semantic, and syntactic structures and patterns. So we can ask the question, which of the two is more inclusive, cultural translation or linguistic translation? Of course, it is cultural translation. Why? Because culture is the main umbrella concept and paradigm under which other types of norms or beliefs or lifestyles can come and be classified as belonging to that particular general broad category. So language, tradition, beliefs, customs, lifestyles, world visions are all included in the concept of culture, and of course this can be actually considered as part of cultural translation on the part of the translator as well as the writer when trying to translate their own visions and traditional heritages and so on. Now, the most recent definition of translation is that of rewriting. Especially in post-colonial studies, you have the post-colonial concept of rewriting of English. So those Anglophone writers or Francophone writers or writers who are called post-colonial writers, all of them have appropriated or used the colonizers' language or English in all kinds of innovative ways, effectively rewriting English, French, and Portuguese poetry and prose. So what they are rewriting? They are rewriting not just the language, but the forms of writing such a language. They rewrite particular patterns of literary representation to represent their own specific culture and heritage. With regard to language, they try to actually contribute some sort of innovation to the writing of English, making it more appropriate to native usage and communication patterns. So, for example, in the case of Arab American or Arab British writers, a lot of writers who are post-colonial ones, of course, have tried to Arabize English by using words that seemingly English, but they are actually given as they are in the original native Arabic language. For example, lamba instead of lamp, shish instead of wooden blinds, tarha, okay, here tarha, but tarha is actually taking the pronunciation of the English word and connoting here, okay, the word, the headdress or the veil as here given. Even expressions like inshallah or insha'Allah is actually given here in transliteration as equal to God willing. Assalamu alaikum, which is another form of greeting in Arab society. Here you have actually peace be upon you. So these strategies of rewriting English give more originality and weight to the translation, for example, of literary texts from Arabic into English. Now, in the case of women writers or feminist writings, you have also the main concept of translation as rewriting. So here you have feminists rewriting the dominant discourse on their own. So feminist writers aim to subvert dominant discourses, stretching language elastically, playing with language, inventing language anew, rewriting and reformulating. Of course, the title of this slide is Retranslating Sexiest Language. Now, sometimes the translator needs to retranslate what is given to him or her in a new way. So here you have an example of this sexiest language in the statement that the artist is a man of his time. He creates. So instead of the writer could have written they or she and so on. He creates a visual manifestation of the deepest longings of his culture. And again, his and he and his time all are indicative of the male personhood rather than the female one. So it can be rewritten or retranslated as artists are products of their times. They create visual manifestations of the deepest longings of their cultures. And that translation would be إن الفنانين هم نتاج عصرهم فهم يبدعون نماذج مرئية تعبر عن أعمق المشاعر والأحاسيس لثقافاتهم وذلك بدلا من إن الفنان هو نتاج عصره فهو لأنها تعبر عن الرجل للمرأة، فهو يبدع نموذجا مرئيا يعبر عن أعمق المشاعر والأحاسيس لثقافته، وبذلك تكون هذه الجملة نوع من أنواع اللغة المتحيزة للرجال ضد النساء، فلا بد أن يستبدلها المترجم أو المترجمة بصيغة الجمع حتى يشير في صياغته إلى الرجال والنساء معا. Here, which is a historical one. And here you have to bear in mind that the historical context of the translation is very important. You have to understand when the statement is given, when the text is written, by whom and for whom, and in which historical context. Here you have an example of this sophisticated, context of the translating process when the translator tries to translate an opening speech given by the US or the American president in 1939, when opening or inaugurating the New York World's Fair. So the announcer gives his announcement as it's the biggest international exhibition ever conceived and carried out by man. And American President Roosevelt states, I hereby dedicate the New York World's Fair of 1939 and I declare it open to all mankind. So he dedicates the fair and opens it to all mankind. So for whom? The whole event is dedicated to mankind. Of course, here in English, the translation or the rewriting process can include, instead of man, humans, or humanity, and instead of mankind, humanity or all humans in general. Of course, the translation will try to avoid such sexist language by trying to find alternative options that are more neutral and more objective. إنه أكبر معرض دولي تخيلته عقول البشر ونفذوه على أرض الواقع. ومن هنا فإنني أفتتح هذا المعرض الدولي في نيويورك في عام 1939 وأهديه لكل البشر. The final slide is about a very recent and important phenomenon, which is globalization. Now, translation has completely changed in the last 20 years because of what is known as the information technology revolution. The widespread of the internet and the spread of IT everywhere in merchandise, international trade, in political conferences and summits, and in schools and educational institutions, all this has affected translation so widely and so greatly. One of the important results of globalization in the field of translation is what is known as web localization, or the recreation of websites, not just websites, but recreation of different linguistic patterns and cultural media that are completely different from one country to another and from one product to another. So the recreation of websites in different language versions, as you see, you have Microsoft, for example, Windows, represented in all different types of languages, even in Arabic. So the desktop is not just desktop in Arabic, it is Sath al-Maktab. Here you have some sort of localization. This is called a localization, or the changing of the language of representation in the different products presented and given to different type of people or masses. So here translation is given as a hybrid activity requiring many types of skills, not just the linguistic skills, not just the knowledge of usage and dictionaries, etc. But the translator, the professional translator, must have a lot of skills other than the linguistic ones, such as the literary skills, cultural skills, and and technological skills. Translation here is representative of diversity, and translation is much connected to cultural exchange versus what is known as the monocultures of the mind. So translation has become so diverse and so connected to international cultural exchange of ideas, products, and human resources. This is completely the opposite of the monocultures of the mind, أو الثقافات الأحادية للعقل. If nobody translates texts across cultures, the people in different cultures will end with one final single product. Is the monoculture of the mind, أحادية التفكير وأحادية العقل. It's the inability to understand otherness and foreignness on its own terms. So for example, Kellogg's, the American international company of cereal, has tried to market its main product of cereal and cornflakes in India, but it failed. Why? Because the Indians were not that familiar with the product and its name, cornflakes. That's why they tried to localize the product name in order to make it seemingly more familiar to the Indian culture and Indian context, calling it, instead of cornflakes, basmati flakes. And it did win actually in that way, because actually here the culture or the consumer culture could accommodate such foreign products by trying actually to taste it, to buy it, and to use it, as any native, agricultural product or food product in general. Now, translation in the global area, uses many machines and programs to facilitate the translating process. One of the IT media used in translation is of translation memories. So the memory here actually is a sort of an index or a repertoire conserving actually the traditional language and culture of a particular culture. And of course, this is completely the opposite of cultural amnesia, which relies on forgetfulness of what has already done or what has already said. So translation helps us as cultural agents to keep traces of our own culture intact.